Welcome to Warming Tales Frias. A luxury first-class cabin ignites a shocking story of prejudice and unexpected revelations. When a flight attendant insults a black couple, she unknowingly challenges the CEO and CFO of the very airline she works for. What happens next is a powerful lesson in respect, justice, and transformation. Before we unravel this incredible story, take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to the world. Let's dive in.
The Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with early morning activity, a symphony of hurried footsteps, rolling luggage, and muffled announcements. In the sanctuary of the first-class lounge, however, the atmosphere was worlds apart, hushed, opulent, and meticulously curated. Polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of designer light fixtures, while a faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air. Travelers lounged in plush chairs, their expressions relaxed as they flipped through newspapers or tapped away on laptops. David and Maria Johnson entered quietly, their presence understated, yet commanding. David, in a tailored blazer and dark jeans, carried himself with an effortless confidence. Maria, dressed in an elegant yet simple blouse and slacks, exuded a poised grace that turned heads. Despite their polished appearance, they were no strangers to the subtle undercurrents of bias that often accompanied their entry into such spaces. As they approached the concierge desk, a young attendant glanced at them, her polite smile faltering ever so slightly. "Good morning," she greeted, her voice tinged with an almost imperceptible hesitation. "May I see your boarding passes?" David handed over the tickets without a word, his expression calm. The attendant's eyes flicked to the first-class designation, and for a brief moment, something unreadable crossed her face. Curiosity? Skepticism? She quickly recovered, returning the tickets with a bright smile. "Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. Enjoy your stay in the lounge." Maria caught David's eye as they walked toward a quiet corner. "You noticed that, didn't you?" she murmured. David nodded, his lips curving into a wry smile. "Of course, but it's not the first time, and it won't be the last." They settled into their seats, their demeanor relaxed, but their senses sharp. This trip wasn't just a leisurely getaway, it was part of a carefully planned mission. As CEO and CFO of Horizon Airlines, David and Maria had decided to go undercover after a series of reports about discriminatory practices within their company. Despite their success in building an industry-leading airline, they knew the battle against systemic bias was far from over. Maria pulled out her tablet, scrolling through notes from their last board meeting. "The numbers don't lie," she said softly. "Customer satisfaction scores in first class are noticeably lower for minority passengers. We need to see why." David leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the lounge. "And we will," he said firmly, "not as executives but as customers. Let's see how deep this goes." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a sharply dressed lounge attendant. Unlike the concierge at the front desk, this man exuded warmth and professionalism. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, would you like something to drink? Coffee? Tea? Perhaps a mimosa?" Maria smiled. "Just coffee, thank you." David nodded. "Make that two." The attendant disappeared as swiftly as he had appeared, leaving the couple alone again. As Maria sipped her coffee, her eyes scanned the room. Most passengers were engrossed in their own worlds, but a few pairs of eyes lingered on them a bit too long. It wasn't hostility, it was the curiosity that often accompanied the unspoken question, "Do they belong here?" David followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Let them wonder," he said quietly. The boarding announcement came sooner than expected. As David and Maria made their way to the gate, the same concierge from earlier gave them a brief, almost apologetic smile. They stepped onto the plane, greeted by a flight attendant who barely glanced at them before directing them to their seats in first class. Patricia, The lead flight attendant stood nearby, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the couple. David and Maria settled into their seats, their movements practiced and composed. Patricia's smile was perfunctory as she approached. "Good. Morning. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Her tone was polite, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. Maria shook her head. "We're fine for now, thank you." Patricia lingered a moment longer than necessary, her gaze flicking between them. "If you need anything, let me know," she said, her smile tight as she walked away. Maria turned to David. "And so it begins." David didn't respond, his focus shifting to the safety demonstration, but Maria could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. They had prepared for this moment, yet the sting of bias was something no amount of planning could dull entirely. As the plane began its ascent, Patricia's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the start of in-flight services. David and Maria exchanged a glance, silently steeling themselves for what was to come. They had faced challenges far greater than this, but each encounter was a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. And Patricia, whether she realized it or not, was about to play a pivotal role in their journey toward transforming the culture of their airline, and perhaps beyond. As Patricia observed the couple from her vantage point near the galley, a faint smirk played on her lips. "Let's see how long they last," she muttered to a fellow crew member, setting the stage for the brewing confrontation. The first-class cabin of Horizon Airlines Flight 298 exuded sophistication. Gleaming mahogany accents, leather seats with ample legroom, and a curated playlist of soft jazz filled the air. For most passengers, this environment promised comfort and exclusivity, but for David and Maria Johnson, it was yet another arena where unspoken judgments often played out. Patricia, the lead flight attendant, moved briskly down the aisle, her demeanor efficient but laced with subtle tension. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her blonde hair neatly pinned back, and her smile calculated. She had worked hard to reach her position, overcoming years of personal struggles and professional challenges. Yet, deep down, Patricia harbored biases she rarely questioned, biases that now simmered as she observed the couple seated in 3A and 3B. "They don't exactly scream first class, do they?" Patricia whispered to a fellow flight attendant as they prepared for the meal service. Her colleague, a younger attendant named Emily, looked uneasy. "They're passengers just like anyone else," Emily replied, her tone cautious. Patricia shrugged, her expression dismissive. "Maybe, but I've seen plenty of people try to sneak into first class. You can tell who belongs and who doesn't." Meanwhile, David and Maria settled into their seats, the tension in the air palpable. Maria opened her tablet, pretending to read, but her sharp eyes were observing every detail. David, on the other hand, maintained his usual calm exterior, though his fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, a subtle tell that Maria recognized. "She's watching us," Maria murmured, not looking up. David smirked faintly. "Let her. We're not here to make her comfortable." A flight attendant approached with a tray of drinks, her smile genuine and unforced. "Would you like a glass of champagne or orange juice before we begin meal service?" she asked. Maria returned the smile. "Just water, thank you." David nodded. "I'll take the same." As the attendant walked away, Patricia passed by, her gaze lingering on their untouched drinks. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her tone dripping with politeness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything's fine," David replied evenly, meeting her gaze without flinching. Patricia hesitated, clearly expecting a different response. "Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," she said, her smile tight before walking away. Maria glanced at David, her voice low. "She's trying to figure us out." "She doesn't need to," David replied. "She already has." Patricia returned to the galley, her unease growing. She had served countless passengers over the years, and most interactions were transactional at best. But something about David and Maria unsettled her. They didn't fit the image she associated with first-class travelers. No designer luggage, no ostentatious displays of wealth. Their quiet confidence felt almost out of place, challenging her ingrained assumptions. "Are they bothering you?" Emily asked gently, noticing Patricia's furrowed brow. "No," Patricia said quickly, too quickly, "but people like them, they don't usually fly up here, you know." Emily frowned. "People like them?" "You know what I mean," Patricia replied, her tone defensive. "It's not like I'm being rude. I'm just saying it's unusual." Emily didn't respond, but her disapproval was evident. She turned back to her duties, leaving Patricia alone with her thoughts. Back in their seats, David and Maria continued to draw glances from nearby passengers. A middle-aged man across the aisle adjusted his glasses, pretending to read, but clearly eavesdropping. An older woman, a row ahead, leaned slightly toward her companion, whispering behind a manicured hand. Maria sighed softly. "Do you ever get tired of this?" David glanced at her. "Tired of what?" "This." She gestured subtly around the cabin. "The whispers, the stares, the constant need to prove ourselves." David leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about proving anything, Maria. It's about showing them that their assumptions don't define us." Maria smiled faintly, her admiration for her husband shining through. "And that's why I married you." As the meal service began, Patricia took it upon herself to personally serve David and Maria. She approached their seats with an air of exaggerated politeness, her tray held firmly. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," she began, her voice smooth, "we have a selection of entrees today: roasted salmon, grilled chicken, or a vegetarian pasta. What can I get for you?" "I'll have the salmon," Maria said calmly. "The chicken for me," David added. Patricia noted their choices with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excellent. I'll have those out for you shortly." As she walked away, Maria leaned toward David. "Did you see the way she looked at us?" "I saw," David replied, "but let her play her game. She'll reveal herself soon enough." Behind the curtain separating first class from the galley, Patricia whispered to another crew member, "I'm telling you, something about them doesn't add up. They're too composed." The crew member, a man in his 40s named Mark, frowned. "What are you saying, Patricia?" "I don't know," Patricia admitted. "But I've seen people fake their way into first class before. Maybe they swapped tickets with someone." Mark shook his head. "You're overthinking this. Just do your job." Patricia bristled but said nothing. Deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was right, and she was determined to prove it. As Patricia returned to the cabin, her gaze settled on David and Maria once again. This time, her professional mask slipped ever so slightly, revealing the storm brewing beneath. "If they think they can fool me," she thought to herself, "they've got another thing coming." The cabin was alive with subtle tension as Patricia made her way back toward David and Maria's seats. Her movements were brisk, her expression set with the kind of determination that signaled trouble brewing. The hum of conversation among passengers faltered, replaced by a quiet anticipation. People sensed that something was about to happen, though few could guess how far it would escalate. David sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the in-flight map, glowing softly on the screen in front of him. Maria, ever perceptive, noticed Patricia's approach out of the corner of her eye. She reached over, placing a calming hand on David's. "Stay steady," she whispered. "I always do," David replied, his voice a low murmur. He didn't look at Patricia but leaned back slightly, preparing himself for what he knew was coming. "Excuse me," Patricia said, her tone sharp enough to turn heads nearby. She stood just beside their seats, clipboard in hand, her eyes narrowing. At the couple. "There seems to be some confusion." Maria looked up, her expression calm but curious. Confusion, she echoed. Yes, Patricia said. I've double-checked the manifest, and I don't see your names listed for these seats. Are you sure you're in the right section? The words hung in the air like a challenge. David finally looked up, his expression unflinching. Our boarding passes say 3A and 3B, he said simply. Perhaps you'd like to check again. Patricia's lips thinned as she glanced at the clipboard, flipping through the pages in a show of diligence. It's possible there's been a mistake at the gate, she said, her voice laced with a thin veneer of professionalism. We do get mix-ups from time to time. Maria tilted her head slightly. So you're suggesting that the mistake is ours? She asked, her tone calm but pointed. I'm suggesting, Patricia said, her voice tightening, that it's unusual to see passengers unfamiliar with first-class protocols. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their curiosity now mingled with unease. A man across the aisle cleared his throat but said nothing. An older woman in the row ahead leaned slightly forward, her hand gripping the armrest as she glanced back. David exchanged a quick glance with Maria. Patricia, is it? He asked, his voice steady and authoritative. That's correct, Patricia said, her smile thin. Patricia, we've flown first class on Horizon Airlines more times than I can count, David continued. I assure you there's no mistake. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't back down. Instead, she gestured toward the boarding passes on the tray table. May I see those again, please? David leaned forward, his movements deliberate. He picked up the tickets and handed them to her without a word. Patricia scrutinized them as if searching for evidence of forgery, her frown deepening. After several long moments, she handed them back. Well, she said, her tone clipped, these appear to be valid, but it's still highly irregular. Highly irregular? Maria interrupted, her voice calm but carrying a hint of steel. In what way? Patricia hesitated, her composure slipping. I'm just saying it's unusual. Passengers who don't fit the typical profile. Profile? David interjected, his voice cutting through the cabin's hushed atmosphere. What exactly is the typical profile, Patricia? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Patricia's mouth opened, then closed again, her confidence faltering under David's steady gaze. Several passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort with the situation growing. At that moment, Emily, the younger flight attendant, stepped forward. Her expression was strained as she gently touched Patricia's arm. Is everything all right here? She asked, her voice a mix of concern and subtle warning. Patricia stiffened. Everything's fine, she said quickly. I'm just clarifying some seating issues. Emily glanced at David and Maria, her expression apologetic. I'm so sorry for any inconvenience, she said softly. If there's anything you need, please let me know. David inclined his head slightly. Thank you, Emily. We're fine. As Emily retreated, Patricia's composure cracked further. Her voice dropped to a murmur, audible only to David and Maria. I don't know how you manage this, but it won't last. People notice when something doesn't belong. Maria's hand tightened slightly on the armrest, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on Patricia. David, however, leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Patricia, he said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight, I suggest you think very carefully about what you're implying. Patricia blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. I'm not implying anything, she said quickly. Though her tone betrayed her uncertainty, David's expression softened just slightly, but his voice remained firm. Then perhaps it's time to stop this conversation before it goes any further. The silence that followed was palpable, broken, only by the faint hum of the engines. Patricia, clearly flustered, straightened her uniform and stepped back. I'll be back to check on you later, she said stiffly before walking away. Maria exhaled slowly, her grip on the armrest relaxing. That could have gone worse, she said quietly. It's not over, David replied, his tone measured. "But it will be soon." In the galley, Patricia leaned against the counter, her frustration bubbling over. "Who do they think they are?" she muttered under her breath. Emily, who had overheard, frowned. "Patricia, you're crossing a line. Let it go." "I can't," Patricia snapped. "They're making a mockery of everything this cabin stands for." Emily shook her head. "Maybe it's time to ask yourself why you think that." Patricia didn't reply, but her jaw tightened. She wasn't ready to let go of her assumptions, not yet. As Patricia returned to the cabin, her determination to assert control hadn't waned. But this time, David was ready. When she approached again, clipboard in hand, he stood, calmly reaching into his pocket. "Perhaps you should know who you're speaking to," he said, his voice steady as he revealed his identity, leaving Patricia and the rest of the cabin stunned. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet after Patricia's initial confrontation with David and Maria. The soft hum of the engines filled the space, but an undercurrent of tension lingered, palpable to everyone nearby. Passengers shifted in, their seats, some pretending to read, others stealing glances at the couple in 3A and 3B. Patricia, however, had not retreated entirely. Standing near the galley, clipboard in hand, she watched David and Maria with a simmering mixture of frustration and defiance. David leaned slightly toward Maria, his voice low. "It's coming." Maria nodded subtly, her calm exterior a stark contrast to the storm she knew was brewing. "Let her make her move," she said. "She's only digging herself deeper." Patricia took a breath, squaring her shoulders before striding back toward the couple. This time, her steps were slower, more deliberate, as though rehearsing the words she planned to say. The soft rustle of her uniform drew the attention of nearby passengers, their curiosity rekindled. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," Patricia began, her voice tight but controlled. "I need to ask you again. Are you absolutely certain these seats are yours?" David looked up, his gaze steady. "As certain as we were the first time you asked." Patricia's smile was thin and forced. "You'll have to forgive me for being thorough, but I've been reviewing our seating manifest again, and something still doesn't add up." Maria raised an eyebrow. "What exactly doesn't add up, Patricia?" Patricia hesitated, her confidence faltering for a split second before she recovered. "It's just unusual," she said, her tone carefully measured, "for passengers without frequent flyer status to be seated here." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. A few passengers glanced at each other, their expressions ranging from discomfort to mild shock. Maria tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but sharp. "Unusual," she repeated. "Or unacceptable." Patricia blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I didn't say that," she replied quickly. "I just meant what you meant," David interrupted, his voice calm but unyielding, "is that you've already decided we don't belong here. Isn't that right?" Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, until David slowly rose from his seat. At full height he towered over Patricia, his presence commanding but not intimidating. "Patricia," he began, reaching into the pocket of his blazer, "I think it's time you knew exactly who you're speaking to." He pulled out a sleek black card, embossed with the Horizon Airlines logo and a platinum designation. The sight of it made Patricia freeze, her professional mask slipping entirely. David handed the card to her, his expression unreadable. "That," he said, "is my personal credentials as the CEO of Horizon Airlines. And this," he gestured toward Maria, "is Maria Johnson, our CFO." Patricia's face turned ashen. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the card, her mind scrambling to process the revelation. The murmurs among passengers grew louder, disbelief and astonishment rippling through the cabin. You're..." Patricia stammered, unable to complete the sentence. Yes, David said, his voice firm but devoid of anger. We're the people responsible for ensuring that Horizon Airlines upholds its values of dignity, respect, and fairness, values you failed to embody today. The captain, who had been observing from the cockpit doorway, stepped forward, his expression a mix of concern and professionalism. "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson," he said, addressing them directly, "on behalf of the entire crew, I sincerely apologize for this unacceptable behavior." David nodded, his gaze still fixed on Patricia. "Thank you, Captain," he said, "but this isn't just about us. It's about what this moment represents." The captain turned to Patricia, his tone firm. "You're relieved of your duties. For the remainder of this flight, please gather your belongings and return to the galley." Patricia's eyes widened in shock. "But, Captain, No arguments," the captain said, his voice leaving no room for discussion. "Your actions have consequences." As Patricia retreated, visibly shaken, the captain turned back to David and Maria. "Again, I apologize. If there's anything we can do to make this right, please let me know." David's expression softened slightly. "Your response speaks volumes, Captain. Thank you for addressing this swiftly." As Patricia disappeared into the galley, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. Some passengers looked genuinely ashamed, while others offered apologetic smiles or quiet nods of support. Emily, the younger flight attendant, approached cautiously, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," she began hesitantly, "I'm so sorry for what just happened. Please know that this doesn't reflect how we all feel." Maria's smile was kind but reserved. "Thank you, Emily. It takes courage to speak up." Emily nodded, relief washing over her face. "If there's anything I can do, just let me know." As the plane continued its journey, David and Maria sat in silence. For a while, the weight of the incident settling over them. Finally, Maria spoke. "Do you think she'll learn from this?" David considered the question for a moment. "I hope so," he said. "But whether she does or not, this is a moment we needed. Not just for her, but for everyone watching." Maria nodded. "It's never just about one person, is it?" "No," David agreed. "It's about changing the whole system, one step at a time." Back in the galley, Patricia sat alone, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her mind replayed the confrontation over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. For the first time, she began to question not just her actions, but the beliefs that had shaped them. The tension in the first-class cabin lingered long after Patricia's dramatic retreat to the galley. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances filled with shock, curiosity, and, among some, embarrassment. The revelation that David and Maria Johnson were not just passengers, but the CEO and CFO of Horizon Airlines had shifted the dynamic entirely. David sat back in his seat, his expression calm, yet contemplative. Maria glanced at him, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engines. "Do you think they've learned anything from this?" "Some might," David replied, his eyes scanning the cabin. "But for others, it'll take more than this moment. Change doesn't happen overnight." In the galley, Patricia stood with her back against the counter, her hands gripping its edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind replayed the confrontation, each word from David cutting deeper into her confidence. The card, the title, the authority, it had all felt like a blow she hadn't anticipated. Emily approached cautiously, her voice soft. "Are you okay?" Patricia didn't look up. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought I was doing my job. I didn't think—" She stopped, her words catching in her throat. "That's the problem, Patricia," Emily said gently but firmly. "You didn't think. You assumed." Patricia's eyes snapped up, meeting Emily's gaze. There was no malice in Emily's expression, only quiet disappointment. "You're better than this," Emily added before. Turning away to resume her duties, Patricia remained frozen in place, the weight of Emily's words pressing down on her. For the first time, she began to question not just her actions, but the beliefs that had driven them. Meanwhile, the captain approached David and Maria's seats, his demeanor professional yet apologetic. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he began, his voice steady, "I want to assure you that this situation is being addressed. Patricia's behavior does not reflect the values of Horizon Airlines." David nodded, his tone measured. "I appreciate that, Captain, but addressing one person's actions isn't enough. This is about the culture we've allowed to take root." The captain hesitated, then nodded. "Understood, sir. If there's anything further I can do to make this right, please let me know." Maria offered a polite smile. "Your swift response is appreciated. It's a start." As the captain walked away, a man seated across the aisle leaned slightly toward David. He was middle-aged, with a kind but hesitant expression. "Excuse me," he said quietly, "but I just wanted to say thank you for handling that the way you did." David turned to him, his brow lifting slightly. "Thank you for saying so," he replied. The man glanced down at his hands. "I've been flying for years, and I've seen things that weren't right. But I never spoke up. Seeing you stand your ground, it makes me think I should have done more." David's expression softened. "It's never too late to start," he said. The man nodded, his face thoughtful. "Maybe next time," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Elsewhere in the cabin, conversations sparked among passengers. Some expressed admiration for how David and Maria had handled the situation. Others whispered criticisms, their words tinged with discomfort. "Did you see the way they humiliated her?" one woman muttered to her seatmate. "It was uncalled for." Her companion frowned. "Uncalled for? She brought it on herself. They didn't humiliate her. They just told the truth." "That truth was a little too convenient, don't you think?" the woman countered. "It's easy to play the victim when you have power." Her companion shook his head, his tone sharp. "Power didn't put them in those seats. They earned it. Maybe it's time we stop assuming we know everything about people based on how they look." The woman fell silent, her expression conflicted. Back in the galley, Patricia remained rooted to the spot. The door to the crew rest area opened, and the captain stepped inside. He folded his arms, his voice firm but calm. "Patricia, we need to talk." She straightened, her professional instincts kicking in despite her inner turmoil. "Yes, Captain. What happened out there was unacceptable," he began. "You crossed a line, several lines in fact, but I need to know, do you understand why?" Patricia hesitated, her mind racing. I thought I was protecting the integrity of the cabin," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. "Protecting it from what? From whom?" Patricia looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't think they belonged," she admitted quietly. "And that," the captain said, his tone heavy, "is the problem. Your assumptions didn't just insult two of our most important leaders. They undermined the values we stand for as a company." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back. "I didn't mean to—" "Intent doesn't matter here," the captain interrupted gently. "Impact does. And the impact of your actions today was damaging, not just to them, but to everyone who saw it happen." Patricia nodded slowly, her composure beginning to crack. "What happens now?" "You're being relieved of duty for the rest of this flight," the captain said. "When we land, there will be a formal review. It's up to you whether this moment becomes the end of your career or the start of something better." With that, he left, leaving Patricia alone with her thoughts. Back in their seats, David and Maria exchanged a quiet look. Maria's voice was soft but firm. "Do you think she'll change?" David leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "She has a choice to make," he said. "Whether she learns from this is up to her, But the fact that she's questioning herself, that's the first step. Maria nodded, her hand resting lightly on David's arm. Then maybe this wasn't just about us. Maybe it's about everyone who saw it happen. David smiled faintly. It always is. As the plane neared its destination, Patricia sat alone in the galley, replaying the events of the flight in her mind. For the first time, she began to confront the biases she had carried for so long. The question now was whether she had the courage to change. As the plane continued its journey toward the destination, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin began to shift. The tension that had gripped the space earlier was giving way to a quieter, more contemplative energy. Conversations, once whispered and hesitant, now carried tones of reflection and, for some, awkward self-awareness. Maria leaned slightly toward David, her voice barely audible. "You can feel it, can't you?" David nodded subtly. "The ripple effect. Moments like this always leave an impression, whether people want to admit it or not." Back in the galley, Patricia sat on a fold-down seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her clipboard lay forgotten on the counter beside her, a silent reminder of how the day had unraveled. The captain's words replayed in her mind, each sentence carving deeper into the wall of denial she had built around herself. Emily entered the galley, her footsteps soft. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Patricia." Patricia looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I messed up, didn't I?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "You did. But the fact that you're asking that question means something. A lot of people wouldn't even get this far." Patricia managed a weak smile. "I don't know how to fix it." "You start by listening," Emily said gently, "to yourself, to others, and you stop assuming you already know everything about the people around you." Patricia nodded slowly, the weight of her mistakes settling heavily on her shoulders. For the first time, she felt not just regret, but a flicker of determination to do better. Meanwhile, the passengers in first class continued to process the events of the flight. An elderly woman seated near the front leaned toward her companion, her voice soft but resolute. "I've seen things like this before," she said. "Back in the day, no one would have said anything. But now there's a chance to make things right." Her companion, a younger man with a laptop balanced on his knees, nodded. "It's uncomfortable, but maybe that's a good thing. People need to feel uncomfortable before they can grow." Across the aisle, a middle-aged couple exchanged quiet words of agreement. "We teach our kids about respect," the husband said. "But it's moments like this that remind us how much we still have to learn ourselves." In their seats, David and Maria remained composed, though their minds were far from at rest. Maria glanced at the screen showing their flights. Progress then back at David. "What do you think will happen when we land?" David considered her question carefully. "There will be fallout," he said, "not just for Patricia, but for the company. This isn't just about one incident. It's a reflection of deeper issues, and now everyone knows we're aware of it." Maria nodded. "Do you think they'll try to sweep it under the rug?" "They can't," David replied firmly. "We won't let them." As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and all carry-on items are stowed. On behalf of Horizon Airlines, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today." The announcement brought a flurry of activity as passengers prepared for landing. Patricia emerged from the galley, her steps hesitant but determined. She approached David and Maria's seats, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I wanted to apologize. I know words can't undo what happened, but I need you to know. I'm sorry." David regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his tone measured. "Acknowledging the problem is "A start, Patricia. What matters now is what you do next." Patricia nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I'll do better," she said. "I promise." Maria offered a small smile, her voice soft but firm. "Promises are important, but actions speak louder." As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the passengers began gathering their belongings. Many cast glances toward David and Maria, their expressions ranging from admiration to quiet reflection. Some even paused to offer words of support as they passed. "Thank you for what you did," one woman said. "It gave me a lot to think about." Another passenger, the man who had spoken to David earlier, stopped briefly. "You didn't just stand up for yourselves," he said. "You stood up for all of us." David inclined his head slightly. "We all have a part to play," he replied. In the terminal, the corporate response team awaited David and Maria's arrival. The group, dressed in crisp suits and carrying tablets, appeared visibly nervous. A tall man stepped forward, his hand extended. "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, I'm Mark Reynolds, Head of Public Relations. We've been briefed on the situation, and I want to assure you that we're taking immediate steps to address it." David shook his hand firmly. "Good to hear, Mark. I expect a detailed plan on my desk by the end of the day tomorrow." "Yes, sir," Mark replied, his voice steady, but his demeanor clearly shaken. Maria stepped forward, her tone calm but authoritative. "And make sure those plans include real, actionable changes, not just lip service. This isn't just about Patricia. It's about the culture we've allowed to exist." Mark nodded quickly. "Understood, Mrs. Johnson. You have my word." As David and Maria walked away, Patricia watched from a distance, her mind swirling with uncertainty and determination. For the first time, she realized that this moment could define her, not by her mistakes, but by how she chose to move forward. The Horizon Airlines headquarters in downtown Chicago was a stark contrast to the chaos of the earlier flight. The gleaming glass skyscraper towered over the bustling city, a symbol of corporate ambition and innovation. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Word of the incident on Flight 298 had spread rapidly through the company's internal channels, and a sense of urgency hung in the air. In the executive boardroom, David and Maria Johnson sat at the head of a long mahogany table, their expressions calm but resolute. Around them, department heads and senior managers shuffled nervously, avoiding direct eye contact with the couple. The head of human resources, a woman named Evelyn Carter, cleared her throat, breaking the tense silence. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," Evelyn began, her voice steady but strained, "I want to assure you that we're taking this matter very seriously. We've already suspended Patricia pending a full review, and we've scheduled a company-wide meeting to address our diversity and inclusion policies." Maria leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "This isn't just about Patricia," she said firmly. "Her actions are a symptom of a larger problem, a culture we've allowed to fester under our leadership. That's what needs to change." David nodded in agreement. "Patricia's behavior reflects on all of us, not just her. If we want Horizon Airlines to be a leader in this industry, we need to take a hard look at the values we claim to uphold and the actions, or inactions, that contradict them." As the meeting continued, the tension in the room began to shift. Department heads who had initially appeared defensive or unsure began to nod along with David and Maria's points. Evelyn, who had been taking notes furiously, raised her hand. "With your permission," she said, "I'd like to propose a comprehensive review of our training programs, hiring practices, and customer service protocols. It's clear we need to address not just individual incidents, but the underlying biases that lead to them." "Agreed," Maria replied. "But it can't stop there. We also need a system for accountability, something that ensures real consequences for discriminatory behavior, regardless of a person's position." David added, "And we'll need to involve outside consultants. It's not enough to rely on internal voices. We need perspectives that challenge us." Evelyn nodded. I'll start reaching out to experts in corporate diversity training immediately. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of the building, Patricia sat in a small conference room, waiting for her meeting with the human resources team. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing with a mix of dread and determination. The events of the flight replayed in her head like a broken record, each detail sharper and more painful than the last. When the door opened, Evelyn entered, followed by a junior HR representative. They took their seats across from Patricia, their expressions professional but not unkind. "Patricia," Evelyn began, "I'm sure you know why we're here. The events of Flight 298 have raised serious concerns about your conduct and its alignment with our company's values." Patricia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "I need to ask you a difficult question. Do you believe your actions were rooted in bias?" Patricia hesitated, the weight of the question pressing heavily on her. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling. "Yes, I didn't realize it at the time, but I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I see that now." Evelyn studied her for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging that is the first step. The next is deciding how you'll move forward." Later that afternoon, the corporate communications team gathered to address the growing public attention surrounding the incident. A draft press release lay on the table, carefully worded to acknowledge the incident without admitting liability. Maria picked up the document, reading it silently before setting it down with a frown. "This isn't enough," she said, her tone firm. "We're not here to protect our reputation. We're here to make a statement, a real one." The head of PR, Mark Reynolds, shifted uncomfortably. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting transparency," Maria replied. "We own up to what happened, explain how we're addressing it, and invite our customers to hold us accountable. Anything less will come across as empty words." David nodded. "This isn't just about damage control. It's an opportunity to lead by example." Mark sighed, but nodded reluctantly. "I'll revise the release." By the end of the day, a new strategy was taking shape. The leadership team had outlined a plan that went beyond surface-level changes. In addition to mandatory diversity training, Horizon Airlines would establish a task force to address systemic issues within the company. Employees at all levels would be encouraged to participate, and regular updates would be shared with the public. David and Maria stood together in the boardroom, watching as the team dispersed. Maria turned to David, her voice quiet but determined. "This is just the beginning." David smiled faintly. "The beginning of something better." As the first round of diversity training began the following week, Patricia found herself sitting in a circle with other employees, her heart pounding. She had made the decision to stay and face the process, but she had no idea what awaited her. Across the room, a facilitator asked the group, "What assumptions do you bring into this space, and how are they holding you back?" The training room was a stark departure from the pristine boardrooms and bustling terminals Patricia was accustomed to. It was a modest space with plain walls, simple chairs arranged in a circle, and a whiteboard at the front displaying the words, "Diversity and Inclusion, Embracing Change." The environment was intentionally unassuming, designed to strip away hierarchy and foster open dialogue. Patricia entered hesitantly, clutching a notebook to her chest. Around her, employees from various departments trickled in: pilots, flight attendants, administrative staff, all wearing name tags that identified them by first name only. It was clear this wasn't about titles or rank. Today, everyone was equal. She chose a seat near the back, hoping to remain inconspicuous. Her heart pounded as she glanced around the room, noticing the wide range of expressions, some curious, others skeptical, and a few outright hostile. A young man across the circle caught her eye and offered a tentative smile. Patricia managed a weak one in return before quickly looking away. The session began with the facilitator introducing themselves. "Good morning, everyone," said the woman standing at the front of the room. Her name tag read Lila. She had an approachable demeanor, her voice calm but firm. "I want to start by thanking you for being here. These conversations aren't easy, but they're necessary." Lila gestured toward the whiteboard. "We're here today to talk about assumptions, how we form them, how they influence our actions, and how we can challenge them. Let's start with a simple question. What assumptions do you bring into this space, and how might they hold you back?" The room was silent at first. Patricia avoided making eye contact, her mind racing. What assumptions? Too many to count, she thought grimly. A man in his 50s, wearing a pilot's uniform, was the first to speak. "I'll admit," he began, "when I first heard about this training, I thought it was just another corporate box to check, but after what happened on Flight 298, well, it made me realize I've been ignoring some things I shouldn't have." Several heads nodded in quiet agreement. Patricia felt a pang of guilt as the memory of that flight resurfaced, vivid and raw. As the discussion continued, the tone shifted from guarded to more open. Employees began sharing personal stories, times when they had been on the receiving end of bias, or when they had unintentionally perpetuated it. Patricia listened intently, her notebook untouched in her lap. Then Lila addressed her directly. "Patricia, would you like to share your thoughts?" The room turned toward her, and for a moment, Patricia felt as though the air had been sucked from her lungs. She hesitated, every instinct telling her to deflect. But then she remembered David's words on the flight. "Acknowledging the problem is a start." She took a deep breath. "I've made assumptions about people," she began, her voice shaky but steadying as she spoke. "I let those assumptions dictate how I treated them, and on Flight 298, I hurt people because of it." The room was silent, every eye on her. Patricia swallowed hard and continued. "I told myself I was just doing my job, but the truth is, I wasn't. I was letting my biases take control, and I didn't even realize it until it was too late." After Patricia's admission, the discussion deepened. Other employees began to open up about their own biases, creating a space of shared vulnerability. One young flight attendant shared how she had struggled with unconscious stereotypes when serving passengers from different cultures. A mechanic spoke about feeling overlooked because of his accent and background. Lila guided the group skillfully, encouraging them to explore not just their experiences, but the systems and structures that perpetuated these biases. "It's not just about individual behavior," she said. "It's about recognizing how our systems reinforce those behaviors and committing to change them." Patricia found herself nodding along, her initial resistance giving way to a growing sense of accountability. She realized that this wasn't just about atoning for her mistakes, it was about becoming part of the solution. Toward the end of the session, Lila asked for volunteers to lead smaller discussion groups in the coming weeks. There was a pause as participants looked around, waiting for someone else to step forward. Patricia felt her pulse quicken. She knew what she needed to do, but fear held her back. Then, almost without thinking, she raised her hand. "I'll do it," she said. Her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Lila smiled warmly. "Thank you, Patricia. Leadership starts with courage, and this is a courageous step." As the session concluded, Patricia lingered for a moment, watching as her colleagues mingled and exchanged thoughts. The young man who had smiled at her earlier approached, his expression thoughtful. "What you said today, it meant a lot," he said. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong." "I respect that." Patricia managed a genuine smile this time. "Thank you. It's not easy, but it's necessary." Later that evening, Patricia sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on the day. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was daunting, but she was no longer running from it. She had made a commitment, not just to Horizon Airlines, but to herself. 1 year later, Patricia stood at the front of a training room, addressing a new group of employees. Her name tag now read, Diversity Trainer. "I want to start by sharing a story," she began, her voice confident and steady. "It's about a mistake I made and what I learned from it." The Horizon Airlines headquarters buzzed with activity as employees gathered in a newly renovated training room. A year had passed since the incident on Flight 298, and the company was celebrating the success of its transformative initiatives. Posters lining the walls displayed slogans like "Fly Fair," "Horizon's commitment to equity," and "Change takes flight." For many, this event symbolized not just progress, but the potential for continued growth. At the front of the room stood Patricia, her demeanor confident yet humble. Her name tag now read, Diversity Trainer, Horizon Airlines. She adjusted the microphone, scanning the room filled with new employees, seasoned veterans and executives. Among them, David and Maria Johnson sat quietly near the back, their expressions warm but expectant. "Good morning," Patricia began, her voice steady. "I want to start by sharing a story about a mistake I made and the lessons I learned from it." The room fell silent, all eyes on her as she recounted the events of Flight 298. She spoke candidly about her assumptions, the confrontation with David and Maria, and the impact it had on her personally and professionally. "I thought I was protecting the integrity of first class," she admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But what I was really doing was upholding my own biases. That day, I hurt people, and I realized I needed to change." As Patricia continued, she shifted the focus from herself to the broader changes at Horizon Airlines. She highlighted the success of the FlyFair initiative, which included mandatory diversity training, anonymous employee feedback channels, and a scholarship program for underrepresented communities pursuing careers in aviation. "Change isn't easy," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It takes effort, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But it's worth it. Today, Horizon Airlines isn't just a better company, it's a better community." After Patricia's speech, the audience broke into applause. David and Maria exchanged a quiet look of approval before standing to join the rest of the room. As Patricia stepped down from the stage, employees approached her to express their gratitude and admiration. "You've come a long way," Maria said when they finally reached her. Patricia smiled, her expression genuine. "Thanks to you both. You didn't just hold me accountable, you gave me the opportunity to grow." David nodded. "Accountability without compassion doesn't lead to transformation. You've earned your place here, Patricia." The celebration continued with breakout sessions, where employees shared their experiences with the company's new culture. A young mechanic described how the scholarship program had allowed his sister to attend aviation school. A flight attendant spoke about how the training sessions had opened her eyes to the unconscious biases she carried. Even longtime employees admitted that the changes, though initially challenging, had made them better colleagues and better people. Amid the discussions, Evelyn Carter, the head of human resources, approached David and Maria. "I just wanted to thank you both," she said. "What started as a difficult moment has become a turning point for this company." Maria smiled. "It was never just about that one flight. It was about creating something bigger than ourselves." David added, "The real credit goes to everyone who embraced the change. Culture shifts don't happen because of mandates. They happen because people care." As the event wound down, David and Maria stepped outside to admire the city skyline. The air was crisp, the kind of early autumn day that hinted at the change of seasons. Maria slipped her arm through David's, her voice soft. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked. "What we've done here." David was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "It's a start," he said finally. "But change isn't a destination, it's a journey. And as long as we keep moving forward, it'll always be worth it." Inside, Patricia lingered in the empty training room, tidying up after the event. She picked up her name tag, running her fingers over the words, "Diversity Trainer." A faint smile crossed her face as she thought about how far she had come and how far she still had to go. For Patricia, the journey wasn't just about making amends for her mistakes. It was about using her experiences to help others see what she had learned, that assumptions can be unlearned, that biases can be challenged, and that real change begins with one courageous step. Months later, Horizon Airlines is recognized on a global stage for its leadership in equity and inclusion. As David and Maria prepare for a press conference, a young intern approaches, inspired by their story. "How do you keep pushing for change when it's so hard?" she asks. David smiles and replies, "Because every step forward is a step worth taking." The Grand Ballroom in New York City was electric with anticipation. The air buzzed with conversations among industry leaders, media representatives, and Horizon Airlines employees. It wasn't just another corporate event. This was a celebration of transformation, a testament to what a company could achieve when it chose to lead with integrity and courage. At the center of it all stood David and Maria Johnson, the heart and soul of Horizon Airlines' journey. Behind them, a massive banner read, "Fly Fair, transforming the skies together." David adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. His calm yet commanding voice echoed through the room. "Good evening. When Maria and I started Horizon Airlines, we had a dream of not just transporting people, but connecting them. We believed that every passenger, every employee, and every partner deserved to feel valued and respected." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But a year ago, we faced a hard truth. We weren't living up to those ideals. The incident on Flight 298 was a wake-up call, not just for our company, but for Maria and me personally. It forced us to confront uncomfortable realities, to acknowledge that good intentions are not enough." Maria stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "That's why we launched the Fly Fair initiative. This wasn't about damage control, it was about redefining who we are as a company. We committed to listening, learning, and leading by example. And while we've made progress, tonight is not the end of our journey. It's just another step forward." As she spoke, Patricia sat in the audience, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. She thought back to the training sessions she had once dreaded, the moments of self-reflection that had left her raw and vulnerable. She had come a long way from the person she was on that flight, a journey that wasn't easy but was undoubtedly worth it. Maria continued, her gaze scanning the room. "Change is never easy. It's uncomfortable, messy, and sometimes it feels impossible, but it's also necessary. Tonight, we celebrate not just what Horizon Airlines has achieved, but the people who made it happen, the ones who chose to embrace discomfort, to confront their biases, and to believe in a better future." As Maria finished, the applause was thunderous, filling the ballroom with energy. David smiled, stepping back from the podium. "But instead of just telling you what we've done, I'd like you to hear from someone who embodies the spirit of this transformation." He gestured toward the audience. "Patricia, would you join us on stage?" The room quieted as Patricia rose from her seat, her steps measured but confident. A year ago, she couldn't have imagined standing here, let alone speaking to a crowd this size. But now she understood that growth required vulnerability, and she was ready. "Thank you," Patricia began, her voice steady as she gripped the microphone. "A year ago, I made a mistake, a big one. I let my assumptions and biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt people because of it. I thought I was just doing my job, but the truth is, I was failing at something much bigger, treating others with dignity and respect." She paused, scanning the audience. But thanks to the Fly Fair initiative and the guidance of leaders like David and Maria, I was given the opportunity to learn and grow. I've spent the past year confronting not just my actions, but the beliefs that shaped them. It's been one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it's also been the most rewarding. The audience listened intently as Patricia's voice grew stronger. "Today, I'm proud to be part of a company that doesn't just say it values equity, it lives it. And I'm grateful for the chance to help others see that change is possible, no matter where you start." As she stepped back, the applause was overwhelming. Patricia glanced at David and Maria, who nodded in approval. In that moment, she felt a sense of redemption, not just for herself, but for the company she now proudly represented. The evening concluded with testimonials from employees, community partners, and scholarship recipients who had been directly impacted by Horizon Airlines' efforts. One young pilot, the first in her family to enter aviation, spoke about how the company's initiatives had inspired her to pursue her dreams. "I used to think this industry wasn't for people like me," she said. "But Horizon Airlines showed me that there's a place for everyone in the skies." The room erupted into applause, and Maria leaned toward David. "This is why we do it," she whispered. David smiled. "And we're just getting started." Months later, Patricia stood in the aisle of a Horizon Airlines flight, her uniform crisp and her demeanor calm. She greeted passengers warmly as they boarded, her tone genuine and welcoming. "Good afternoon. Welcome aboard," she said to a middle-aged man who hesitated at the door. The man glanced at her, his expression skeptical. "This is first class, right?" Patricia met his gaze steadily, a smile on her lips. "Yes, sir, and we're honored to have you here." As the man nodded and moved to his seat, Patricia felt a quiet satisfaction. She had faced her biases, owned her mistakes, and come out stronger. Every interaction was now an opportunity to embody the values she had once overlooked. Back at Horizon Airlines headquarters, David and Maria prepared for another meeting. A young intern approached them, her eyes wide with admiration. "How do you keep pushing for change when it feels so overwhelming?" she asked. David smiled, his tone gentle but firm. "Because every step forward, no matter how small, is a step worth taking." Maria added, "And because when you believe in something bigger than yourself, you find the strength to keep going." As the intern nodded, David glanced at Maria, his expression full of determination. "Let's get to work. The sky's not the limit. It's just the beginning." As Patricia welcomed passengers aboard the Horizon Airlines flight, she reflected on how far she had come since that fateful day on Flight 298. Walking away from her past biases, she had embraced a new mission: to inspire change, one interaction at a time. Her journey wasn't just about redemption, it was a powerful reminder that growth is possible for anyone willing to take the first step. Patricia's story became more than just a personal transformation. It stood as a testament to the power of accountability, empathy, and the courage to confront our assumptions. Her actions and the changes at Horizon Airlines proved that fairness and equity aren't just lofty ideals. They're values that must be lived every day. Her journey reminds us all that real change begins with small but brave steps. If you were in Patricia's shoes, how would you confront your own biases and make things right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like and share this video to spread the message of growth and equality, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.